Good morning. My name is Melinda Herring, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center here in Washington. We've gathered everyone together today for a webinar about what's next for Ukraine's southern counteroffensive after the Kherson victory. We have Jennifer Caffarella, the Chief of Staff at the Institute of the Study of War, General Wesley Clark, a great friend of ours and the former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, Ambassador John Herbst, the Senior Director of the Eurasia Center and former Ambassador to Ukraine, and finally, former Minister Andrei Zagornyuk, a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council and also the head of a great think tank in Kiev. Welcome, everyone. And I want to go immediately to Zag, to Andrei Zagornyuk. So, Andrei, liberating Kherson was a big deal. Can you explain why and what are conditions like in the city now? I've seen reports on CNN that there's no electricity, no heat, no drinking water. Have any of those services been restored since the city was liberated?
Some of them are being restored as we speak. First of all, I'm sorry. Hello, and thank you for the invitation. It's good to see you. Yeah, situation is very difficult. It's extremely. I just spoke to friends there. Literally like half an hour ago, and they say that they are restoring some of the facilities, but most of the items are either destroyed by Russians before they withdrawn, or like earlier, and a huge amount of utilities are mined. So they actually put booby traps, and they say that there is some journalists are saying that it's probably the most full of mines place in the world or something like that. But indeed, the opinion is that they were putting mines anywhere they could. So right now it's dangerous for citizens to actually go and look to the utilities and any of the facilities themselves. They wait until they would be demined first and then repaired. So that takes time. So people who I spoke to, literally, they say that some houses have gas, natural gas, so they can actually cook on the gas. Some don't. Pretty much no one has electricity. Some generators been delivered, so they use generators, and the water is only basically by delivery. So they're delivering water to, and this is a problem, and this is a shortage of clean drinking water. Technical water they deliver, and they take it literally from Dnieper River. So it's very far from being over. The problem is that nobody can tell how long exactly it will take, because nobody knows how bad situation is. And luckily, we're not yet in the wintertime, because in the wintertime, as you know, if water freezes in pipes, it breaks pipes. So basically, they need to make sure that they clean everything before the frost comes.
Wonderful, Andrei. Back up a little bit though, and zoom out. Why is liberating Kherson a big deal? What does it have to do with the water supply in Crimea? For those of us.
There's lots of dimensions of why Kherson is so important. So first of all, that's the only regional capital ever conquered by Russians during this period of time. It was a very important city. It was a city which stands in a connection between Crimea, Dnieper River, Black Sea. So it's strategic absolutely strategic location. The Dnieper is very wide there, and of course, Kherson is in pretty much all Kherson is on the right bank. I mean, there is no like real proper residential areas apart from like some dachas on the left bank. Left means eastern bank, sorry. So essentially there was like the platform, like a staging ground for further expansion to the west bank coastline of Ukraine. So essentially the Russian plan was, after Kherson to go to Mykolaiv, after Mykolaiv to go to Odessa, and like it's a common knowledge obviously now. So now all these plans are damaged and most likely not going to be realized, and of course they've been putting a huge political meaning to this conquest. They were to the invasion of Kherson. They announced it as they're part of Russia, annexation. They faked that, obviously, as everywhere else, referendums, and they were actively publicizing the idea that Kherson is with Russia forever. Putin announced it from the Red Square literally 5 weeks before Kherson was returned back to Ukraine. So that has a massive importance from how things will unfold from now, because first of all, that explains that all these annexations were fake. I mean, all these referendums were fake. We knew that, but now we see the reaction of Kherson citizens, we're Kherson people, and we clearly understand that we sort of knew that back inside Ukraine, but now the whole world sees that. And whoever had any doubts, I mean, they can look again at the footages from the Kherson as the first reporters got there. Secondly, it sort of kills the whole idea of annexations as some sort of political pressure, because we'd simply ignored that. Our partners ignored that. Our allies ignored that. We just moved on, and we're going to move on further. And actually, Crimea now is not some sort of a special case. It's just one of the 5 regions which Russia is gradually losing. And also, of course, it has a strategic meaning from its location. From the, as I said, it's the beginning of the Dnieper River. Now we can hit the targets on the Crimea road to Crimea. Now we can control channel with the HIMARS weapons, the Crimean channel, and of course we can use that as the that land, that basically the territory, to move further, which we're doing. Into the Black Sea coast and into the further the banks of the Dnieper River, and basically push Russians out. And finally,
let me stop you there. That's perfect.
And finally, if I have a second, finally we the fact that Russians moved out means that they run out of any excuses, so they cannot explain this with anything but military failure, and we can see that they're extremely exhausted right now as the overall Russian capability, which shows us a great deal about their state, and that means that we need to continue pushing them out of the other territories, and that's exactly what we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I think we could have a whole conversation just based on that opening statement. That was really rich and helpful. Thank you. General Clark, Andrew has mentioned heavy winter or real winter. How far, in your assessment as a military general, can Ukraine go before heavy winter sets in? We're hearing a lot about mud again and about how tracked equipment slows down. How much do you think that Ukraine can realistically retake, sir?
I think they can do a lot. Look, the mud, yes, it's a problem for off-road armored vehicle mobility, but this is not 1940 in Ukraine. There are paved roads there. There are ways to move even if it's raining, and you always have special forces and infantry. You have heliborne mobility behind the lines. So the idea that nothing's going to happen, fine, sell that idea. But if I were the Ukrainian military, I'd be working really hard in this period, because the person that the group that's hurting is the Russian military. So there's an old principle of war called the exploitation. When you have a successful attack, you have to, as long as you have the capacity, you have to follow it up. You don't want to reach a culminating point at which the enemy can then circle around behind you, cut you off, and defeat you. That's true at the tactical level, and it's true at the operational level. And I think what we've seen in the Ukrainian forces in their offensive in the south is a very careful husbanding of resources. Where the fighting got tough, they slowed down. They did reconnaissance. They used firepower. They went around enemy strong points, and they continued to cut away at the logistics so that they preserved Ukraine's offensive capacity to the best extent possible. This is why Foreign Minister Zarodnik is saying that they can continue to push, because they didn't do what the amateur military people said was, rush in there and seize Kherson. And no, that's not what happened. They worked it step by step. And I think that process is going to continue to unravel the Russian defenses. Now, the hard part of this is going to be in Donbass, where you have the Wagner group and where the Russians have for a long time set in anchored defenses. But you know what? Crimea is the plum target here. And I think the Ukrainians can go back toward Mariupol and then down into Crimea and get the leverage they need to be able to turn the Russian offensive out of Donbass. The whole idea is you're going to persuade the Russians they're not going to win. And when Putin realizes he can't win militarily, it's over. Whether you've taken half of Crimea, all of Crimea, force them out of Donbass, or next week when Putin says, I can't handle this anymore. We don't have to give Putin an exit. We don't have to give him an off-ramp. Putin's a very smart man. He started this. Let him find his own off-ramp. And we shouldn't have any fears about, oh my goodness, what happens in Russia if there's a conflict and Mr. Putin is overthrown? Good. He deserves it. And the world will be better off. And they say, well, there'll be bad people behind him. Yeah. And the world will deal with that. But Mr. Putin is learning a very tough lesson that should go to all the other autocrats and dictators in the world. This is the 21st century. You don't just invade another country, tear it up, bomb it, destroy its infrastructure, cut up the world's food supply and energy supply and say, oh yeah, this is my historic right to do this. No, you don't. So I think that Ukrainians have handled this very well tactically and operationally. There have been losses, and we don't hear about those Ukrainian losses. And that's a terrible thing, and for the families and so forth. But Ukraine is determined to regain its territorial integrity, and it's establishing itself as a nation in the truest sense of the word. And
thank you, General Clark. Thank you so much. That was really helpful. Jennifer, I'd like to bring you in here. So Zag said that Russian military morale is in the toilet, I think was his phrase, or very, very low. You watched the battlefield very, very closely. How would you assess the morale of Ukrainian and Russian forces at this point?
Thank you for the question. And I think, look, what was true at the start of this war, that Ukraine is fighting for a just and legal purpose, and the Russians are engaged in a war for which they were unprepared, a war of aggression and war crimes. Those realities are continuing to bear out. The Ukrainians have not only stood their ground and repelled the initial Russian invasion, they're now on the offensive. And I think the morale on both sides of the equation, from what we can see, reflects that reality. I think General Clark gave a very good overview of the current military situation and the likelihood that actually we're going to see more fighting, more Ukrainian offensives into the winter. I think it's important to recognize that the Russians here are very vulnerable, perhaps the most vulnerable that they've been since the start of this war. Putin cannot generate military reinforcements fast enough to make a significant difference on this battlefield. Yep. And the forces that he is managing through coercion and other means to generate are being ground up by the Ukrainians about as fast as he can put them into the battle space. So the collapse that we just witnessed around Kherson is not only a significant victory for Ukraine, which it of course is, it's a bellwether for what I think we could see farther to the east and in the subsequent phases of this campaign. The forces that were defending Kherson were among the most professional that Russia has left. And the best thing that they could do in the face of a very sophisticated, as General Clark explained, a very sophisticated Ukrainian offensive, the best those Russian forces could do was retreat and avoid a rout, which in military terms is what we saw up in Kharkiv, which is a disorderly collapse that leaves to the Ukrainians not only significant momentum, but also military hardware. So the Russians are in full disaster mode. They are scrambling to try to mount a defense. They're actually scrambling to try to mount another offense in the Donbass, but they're not succeeding because they don't have the forces. They don't even seem to have the capable command necessary to make good use of the lives, frankly, that Putin is wasting in this war. And I think that's going to continue. I think, therefore, it is essential that the United States continue to support Ukraine at this moment where Ukraine has the momentum, and to recognize that the vulnerable position that Putin is in unfortunately means that the barbarity of this war and his targeting of civilians will continue to increase. We saw the huge bombardment of Ukraine within the last 24 hours. And I would be remiss not to mention that a further reason for continued offensives and continued support is what the Ukrainian population living under occupation is suffering. It doesn't get talked about enough. There is a lot of attention, thankfully, to the war crimes that happen on the front line. But the savagery that is being inflicted upon the Ukrainian population behind front lines is further cause for taking this opportunity, which we really truly do have, to defeat the Russian invasion here for good.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Ambassador Herbst, you're muted, so please unmute. Could you please explain, there's been a lot of talk recently about pushing Kiev to negotiate and showing willingness to negotiate. Is that push dead after the recent missile strikes yesterday? Where is that push and where's it coming from? Can you explain that for us?
This thing is not dead, although the impetus for it is going down. Putin has two cards to play as his military self-destructs in Ukraine. One is fecklessness in the West. They will decide that the costs to the West of this war are so high that we have to help Ukraine make a peace, meaning help Ukraine make concessions, force Ukraine to make concessions. The other, of course, is his nuclear threat. On this issue, it's clear there are some voices within the U.S. administration that are inclined in that direction. But I believe those voices have become weaker in the last week or so. We had very strong statements coming from the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, last Thursday and Friday in two press briefings, describing the facts that are really clear that Russia still has the intent of dominating Ukraine. And as long as that's Russia's negotiating position, negotiations make no sense. Now, I hope that that very clear presentation represents administration policy going forward. I am cautiously optimistic that that's so.
Ambassador Herbst, how can Ukraine get the best peace deal? We know that this will end in some kind of negotiation.
It's very simple. As Ambassador Makarova said at an event here, I'm in Dallas at the Bush Center last night, it's weapons, weapons, weapons. The United States, the Biden administration, has developed and implemented what I consider to be an adequate policy in this extreme crisis situation. We are supplying massive amounts of weapons, substantial economic assistance as well. And that's enough to make sure that Putin does not win in Ukraine, and perhaps that over time, Ukraine can win. That's why I call it adequate. If it were truly strong, we'd be sending Ukraine the advanced weapons it has been requesting, not just since February, but since before February. We've done some of that. We finally sent HIMARS in June, right? We finally are now sending more advanced anti-air systems, only because of the bombardments over the past month. But there's still many things we're not sending. We're not sending longer range artillery. We're not sending longer range missiles. We're not sending advanced tanks, armored personnel carriers. If we had a truly resolute policy, one that we would dominate this crisis, help Ukraine get the equipment that would make the offensive that Andriy was describing, the counteroffensive, successful within months and not over a much greater period of time. That's what the Ukrainians need.
Thanks, John. That's really helpful. General Clark in ZAG, I want to ask you about our friend Ben Hodges' prediction. He says that Ukraine can be back to its February 23rd borders by Christmas, and the Ukrainians can be in Crimea next year. Let's go with ZAG first and then General Clark. What do you think of that prediction? Is it too bullish or is it accurate?
Well, I think it's a bold prediction, and there's just no way of knowing. We're not on the inside of this. We don't have access really to what's going on in Ukraine. We don't know the losses. We don't know the supply factors. We don't really see how long it takes from the time the Pentagon announces another weapon shipment till the weapon shipment gets in. We don't know really what's happening with the territorial forces or reserve forces that have proved so valuable for Ukraine. And that's just on the Ukrainian side. And then there's the Russian side. We don't know where the Russians really stand on this. Starting in late May, the Russians tried to form a 20 battalion tactical group counteroffensive force. And it was going to be formed by July. Well, it didn't form. And then it was going to be ready by September. Well, it's not ready. It was going to be used to cut off the Ukrainian offensive coming across Zaporozhye. It hasn't. Where are those 20 battalion tactical groups under? At one point, they were going to reform and make it the Third Shock Army. We don't know where that is. We don't know at the unclassified level. Let's put it that way. And so when General Hodges says that, yes, it's possible if everything falls the right way. But here's the way I would look at this, Melinda. First of all, it's not a bad thing to be talking to the Russians because the diplomacy cuts both ways. The Russians want to jiggle us so that we don't give strong reinforcements to the Ukrainians. Well, when they talk to us, maybe they get jiggled also and don't take the most extreme measures that they could take to reinforce their own forces. Maybe they think by talking to us, oh, these NATO people, they're so weak. Eventually, they're going to give up. We just need a little more push. Let's don't do full mobilization. Let's do it step by step so it doesn't affect our people in Moscow so much. So this is being fought out on both sides of the line, so to speak. And then there's the issue of why don't we give the Ukrainians more forces? Why don't we finish this? Yesterday's episode, which is looks like it was just an errant Ukrainian air defense missile. Yesterday's episode indicates the potential for escalation and mistakes and accidents as this continues. The best way to resolve this is to resolve it as rapidly as possible. And the best way to do that is to provide the Ukrainians all the equipment that they're asking for. First, the loitering drone, the Switchblade 600. These drones are available. They're not in the US inventory. The Ukrainians want to buy them. The Pentagon won't let them buy them, or that's what is said anyway. I don't know if that's true, and I don't know who's preventing it. The ATACMS missiles, somebody says it's too great a risk. Well, too great a risk in response, in question to what? The risk of allowing the war to continue into 2023 or 2024? The risk of what? A Russian offensive with reconstituted forces that goes after Kyiv again? What, too great a risk in regard to what? And then there's the air power question. You cannot establish a 100% leak-proof anti-missile defense over a country the size of Ukraine, much less over Ukraine and Poland and Czech and so forth. So are we at some point going to say, look, Russia, you're not entitled to a sanctuary. You're doing something illegal. And if the Ukrainians want to go strike your air bases in Novorossiysk or some other place, Belgorod or whatever, they should do so. Stop this war. And, this idea of the escalation being so dangerous, the longer it goes on, the greater the danger. The best way to cap this off is to let the Ukrainians have the strength of weapons and supplies to finish it, and finish it now. And one more point, if I could make it. I hear discussions coming out of the G20 that people say, well, we don't want to be in a bloc. The bloc is a Cold War term. There are no blocs. There is only the international rules-based system. Every nation benefits from the international rules-based system, and Russia's trying to destroy it. How can you say, well, I don't want to be in a bloc, and therefore what? You're going to let Russia try to destroy the rules-based system? Absolutely not. So all these nations sitting on the sidelines, and some of them are US allies who are refusing to support Ukraine, they need to belly up to the bar. Russia's posing a significant challenge to the rules-based system. And everybody, it's not about blocs. The Cold War is over. Let's stand up for the system. Let's finish this war. Ukraine's been incredibly courageous. We don't know the total sacrifices of Ukraine and its people, but they're enormous, and they're sacrifices for all of us.
Thank you, General Clark. I like that. We need to our allies to belly up to the bar. I think we could make a meme out of that. That's great. Thank you so much. Zag, what do you think of the prediction? And that you heard Wes Clark, he was very, very careful in saying we don't have enough information. Is General Hodges too bullish, or is he right? Oh, you're muted, Andre.
We obviously are not we're not completing the operational goals by date, because that's not a correct thing to do. We do it as soon as we can. I mean, dragging it is not obviously in our interest, because we do use the opportunity that Russians are extremely weak right now and very nervous. But at the same time, we do it looking at the operational position, looking at intelligence, understanding where they're, in which part of the front they're weakest, and then we targeting them there. So I cannot say whether we can do something by Christmas or by New Year or something like that. We'll do as much as possible. Let's put it this way. And from the other perspective, I'm quite pessimistic about any negotiations with Putin at all, to be honest. And you mentioned peace deal and so on. I hope that one day there will be a peace deal, but I'm absolutely certain it will not be with Putin, because the problem with him is that lawyers have a term called capacity to contract, which means somebody have a legal chance to actually enter into agreement. Putin doesn't have that anymore, because after the annexations, he basically cut all ties for him to do any negotiations. Ukraine is obviously not going to recognize the annexations under any circumstances. I mean, you can ask any Ukrainian. And this is not something which the global coalition wants. Because one of the minimum terms of what we need, like how this war should end, is that there is a precedent, and this precedent is positive. I mean, positive for the future history. So, which means that the aggression, the genocide, terrorism, whatever Russia is doing right now, is a bad thing, and it's clearly a bad strategy for any leader. So, any other leader shouldn't be inspired by Putin. He should be, discouraged. If anybody has similar ideas, they shouldn't proceed. So, which means that we cannot do any compromises in a territorial integrity. There's absolutely no way it makes sense to even to push on Ukraine about that. There is like zero desire to even start that discussion here.
Yep. We're clear on the point.
Question is what peace deal we're talking about, with who? I mean,
okay, Zach, we got it. No one's suggesting that right now. No one's suggesting that. We got it. I have 22 questions, and Jennifer, I have one more question for you, and then I have a lot of Q&A from our audience. Could you please help us, Jennifer, understand what do you expect in terms of Ukraine's next big push? General Clark outlined some scenarios. Do you think he's right? Is it right to say that there's not much progress likely in the east, and that the south will be easier to retake? Or how do you see this playing out in the coming month or so?
Sure, thanks for the question, and I'll be brief so we can get to audience questions. Look, I don't know what, of course, Ukraine's operational plans are, and I wouldn't say anything if I did. So the Ukrainians are setting the terms of battle here, and they will choose what to do with some of the reinforcements now that they can move on the battle space, now that Kherson is back within Ukrainian control. I do think, however, that establishing what we would call, a lodgment on the eastern bank, the left bank of the Dnipro River, in order to pursue a southern campaign, is among the more militarily difficult campaigns that Ukraine could choose to do. So I think we may actually see instead a rejuvenation of counteroffensives in the east, with the potential, as I think General Clark has already mentioned, to put pressure on the axis towards Mariupol, and ideally to start threatening what is the main Russian ground line of communication or supply line into the south, which still comes by way, through eastern Ukraine. I think if the Ukrainians can pressure that, which I expect is likely in coming months, that we will start to see further pressure and potentially further disarray among the Russian forces that really are struggling to maintain cohesion here entering the winter months.
Wonderful, Jennifer. Thank you so much. Okay, my friends, we have 24 questions. Go ahead and unmute your mic, and I'm going to shoot these questions to you. Please give me a short, succinct answer. Ambassador Herbst is going to show us how to do it. This is from our friend Paul Nyland in Kiev. Hi, Paul. So glad that you're okay. So he says the resolute stance that you mentioned for the kinds of weapons you mentioned to be delivered. What's the path to get to that place? Are the voices in the U.S. administration of this mind gaining momentum?
There is no indication that those who want a more resolute policy are becoming more influential. I'm not saying they're becoming less. I think the pattern we've seen since even before the big invasion persists. The administration says no on the more advanced weapons, then something happens, there's pressure from Congress, from people on the outside like us, and then they change their mind. I expect this pattern to continue. And of course, revelation of Russian atrocities also pushes the administration in the right way. The big aerial bombardment over the past month finally got them off their duff on aerial defense. So that's how this works. I wish it was cleaner than that, but this is what we have.
Thanks, John. Okay, General Clark, this is for you from the Wall Street Journal. Daniela says, how do you see the missile strike in Poland affecting the state of battle, and how do you interpret the reaction to it among NATO allies in Russia?
So I think NATO's reaction has been good. There was a lot of concern. President Biden called the G7 leaders together. So if Putin watched this, he saw that NATO didn't jump back and NATO didn't splinter and people didn't say, oh my God, we got to stop. No. So that was a good reaction. On the military side, I think we need to look at what the disposition is of the air defense assets in Poland. We need to consider whether we need to bring those closer to the border. We need to consider at some point whether we're going to put an air defense umbrella as best we could over cities like Lviv, where there's no Russian ground troops there, where the civilians and infrastructure are just being pummeled. We say it's illegal. We say it's against the laws of war. We have the capacity to stop that. I think we have to start asking ourselves, in the face of these 100 missile strikes a day, why aren't we at least providing air defense and missile defense in areas of Western Ukraine when it's within our capacity to do so? And if it's not done as NATO, why isn't it done as a coalition of the willing?
Great. Jennifer, John, or Zeg, anyone else want to say anything else to this question? How do you see the missile strike in Poland affecting the state of the battle and the reaction from NATO? Anyone have anything different?
I just will add one thing. To be honest, this is far not the first missile strike which we had. We had like a whole waves of missile strikes. And in May and April we've been asking for air defense from our partners since March.
Yep.
And we've been knocking all doors possible. So to be honest with you, I understand this sort of slow step strategy in providing the offensive weapons. It's not that I agree with that strategy, but I at least can understand the meaning and basically the idea of trying to get some kind of conventional escalation as late as possible. Though I don't think it's a good strategy now because we have a compounded effect of the of Russian failures. So I think it's over. But I don't understand the small step strategy with defensive weapons, with such as air defense. Just no idea why this is done. And I spent enough time in DC to understand how certain things are made, and I still don't have the answer. So maybe somebody will help. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, John, here's one for you from our friend Harlan Ullman. Glad that you're here, Harlan. He says, given the missile hit on Poland, can that be exploited in imposing demands on Russia to prevent escalation and indeed increase pressure on him?
Well, that's a very smart question. And the short answer is yes. But the longer answer is I actually don't expect it. I think that, again, the general caution we see coming out of the White House continues. So everyone's been very careful to figure out what's happened with this missile attack in Poland, or the missile strike in Poland. And I think we'll see a continuation again of the same pattern. I once had a professor who said that personality is history. And you have this sort of inclination on the part of the White House, which I believe continues. Again, our response to this crisis has been substantial. It has certainly been up to the need, just has not been visionary and has not been as strong as it could be. And as a result, not just do more Ukrainians die, but the greater possibility of escalation, as Wes Clark pointed out, is there. And the economic pain felt not just by Ukrainians, but by the entire world goes on longer.
Thank you, John. Jennifer, for you, this is from Adrian. Can you please clarify if if only the city of Kherson has been regained or the whole region of Kherson?
Sure. So I'm sure Andre can also speak to this, but the city has been recaptured. But of course, there is still territory on that east bank or the left bank of the river that is, a more difficult military operation for the Ukrainians to be able to prosecute, in part because the Russians really are digging in, and that kind of cross-river operation is just very sophisticated. It would be very costly. We'll see if Ukraine decides to mount it, but I suspect that recapturing that entire Kherson region may not be strategically the most important next step when the Ukrainians have opportunities elsewhere on this battle space to get the Russians out of position and to threaten some of those longer supply lines that I mentioned earlier.
Super, thank you. General Clark, Viola Ginger wants to know on your recommendation of air missile defense in Western Ukraine, how could the West do that without pressure to provide that protection for all of Ukraine?
You simply would declare that there's no ground combat in that area, and you would move forward with your air defense assets. Look, it's Ukraine's airspace. It's not Russia's airspace. If we believe in a rules-based international order and a nation's under attack, say, please come and help us, why can't we help them by helping them protect their own airspace? Now, we've been very careful not to put U.S. forces in there, but other nations, other allied nations have their own forces in there doing logistics, doing other things. Why can't they do air defense? The answer is they could. It's just a question of how, first of all, on the air defense, there are not enough assets. There's no air defense on the shelf. There's no obsolete air defense that you can throw in there that's really good. We're trying to get them the Hawk missiles. The Hawk missiles, 1960 system, updated in the 1980s and 90s. It doesn't have an anti-missile capacity. Could it help? Yeah, and some of them are going to be sent in. But it's not like you've got Patriot batteries that are in reserve somewhere. And that's the same throughout NATO. So that's part of the problem. But the question is, how do you most effectively use what you have to bring the conflict to a successful conclusion as rapidly as possible? And if you use that as the criteria, you might find that putting a couple of Patriot batteries manned by whoever wants to man them into Ukraine to provide greater security in the rear space of Ukraine, which would enable the logistics to be moved forward and so forth, it might be productive. Somebody's got to look at that and do the analysis and say, is the military advantage worth the political trade-offs that have to be made? But it's an option that has to be looked at.
Thank you, General Clark. And General Clark, will I have you, can you explain, this is just an explanation question. So you've explained that Ukraine is very large and there aren't enough air defense systems to cover the whole country. How many does Ukraine have now? How many more does it need? And who could supply them quickly?
I cannot provide that information except to say that Ukraine had maybe half a dozen of the SA-300 systems, maybe a dozen. Some were updated, most were not updated. They're 1970s, 80s technology. They have limited anti-missile capacity. They do have some. We've got two, as I understand it, two NASAM systems on the ground thus far. Another, I think 4 have been promised. These systems, it's not like they're on the shelf. So you've got missiles that are on the shelf, but you've got to assemble the radars, you've got to package it, you've got to train people for it. So they don't have enough. There's not enough out there. And think of it this way. If the range of a Patriot missile is like 60 miles, that doesn't mean it covers 60 miles. It's like a inverted cone. Okay. Because it doesn't cover exactly everything that's at ground level. But if it covered a 60-mile radius, so you could go in 120 miles, Ukraine's a big country. And so you need 5 or 6 of these Patriot organizations every 60 miles throughout Ukraine, or 10 of them across. You need several hundred of them. There aren't several hundred of them that have ever been produced. No country has complete, cohesive air defense coverage. It's always around high-value targets. Okay. That's the reason drones and cruise missiles are successful. They weave their way in around where the radars are and where the air defense is. So it has to be thickened, but it can never be complete.
Thank you. That was so helpful. Zag, a question for you from our friend Anatoly Gritsenko. Anatoly, I'm glad you're here and you're safe. He says, please explain why the Russians were able to withdraw from Kherson almost without losses.
Well, first of all, not necessarily without losses. Secondly, I'm sure that Anatoly is a much greater expert to explain this than I am. And obviously we had a quite organized withdrawal within a couple of days from Kherson area. And as we discussed, Kherson area, this is the right bank. So they did it. We know that there has been a bunch of them of the Russian forces who tried to escaped through all the possible exits. Including like with boats and and whatever the way they could. Our guys played safe, so they played safe, and they just made sure that they got there when they were certain and during the daytime and so on.
Thanks, Zach. Okay, Jennifer, question for you from our friend Bob Humans. He says, approximately how many Russian troops were actually able to leave the right bank? There has been reports of bodies of dead Russians floating in the river. Where do you think the Russian troops who have left the right bank will be redeployed?
I actually don't have a great numbers estimate, Andre. I don't know if you do, for how many forces were able to look. Numbers in these kinds of wars are the hardest thing for anybody to estimate. And to a certain extent, they do have value, but sometimes they can be a little bit distracting. I think what matters in this case is that the Russians decided that it was not in their interest to try to fight. I need to hammer on that, because what we're witnessing in Ukraine is the complete destruction of the professional Russian armed forces. I don't think that gets said clearly enough. And I think the consequences of that sometimes get overlooked. Mm-hmm. So yes, the Russians did manage to hold on to some forces and bring them across the river. And in a certain respect, that's a bad thing, right? They still have forces. They will still now try to defend. And ideally, those forces would be defeated outright. I do think in time that will happen. But I think if we zoom out from that sort of very tactical picture, the destruction of the Russian armed forces has significant consequences for how the US and NATO continue to respond to this. And I'd love to take just one moment to unpack some of the risk elements that I think go into this, incident in Poland and how we handle Putin from here. Because what happens if Putin starts a war with NATO is that Putin loses the war with NATO. The Russian armed forces are being defeated wholesale in Ukraine. Now, can Putin escalate in ways that could be deadly and very dangerous? Yes, he can. And it is very important that we remain very alive to those risks, and that the United States and our allies continue to deter Putin from escalations such as the threatened use of a tactical nuclear weapon, either in Ukraine or in an attempt to change the battlefield reality in Ukraine. We need to deter that. The way that we deter that is what I do think this administration has done quite well in its sometimes too cautious, but still very deliberate approach to this war, which is to make sure that Putin understands that the consequences he will face if he escalates against NATO are going to be so painful that he would rather lose the war in Ukraine than pay that price. That is what deterrence in this conflict means, both in a nuclear sense and in whatever other type of escalation he may try to throw at NATO. We have thus far upheld that kind of deterrence. I think we can continue to uphold that in order to give the Ukrainians the time and space to deal with what is now the non-professional Russian army on the ground, which I do think they will do, perhaps not on quite the timeline that General Hodges anticipates, although who knows, I do certainly hope that he is right.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. Hey, John, a couple questions for you. This is from Eugene Komaroff, the Voice of America's Russian service, and I saw him in Alaska last week. Glad to have you, Eugene. He says, could you please briefly comment on the one-on-one meeting of Bill Burns, CIA director, and Sergei Narishkin, director of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service in Istanbul? How can it affect the military situation and political and diplomatic environment of the war?
The short answer is we don't know what was discussed there. I would hope that a strong message was delivered precisely on Russian escalation with WMD in Ukraine. And we would hope that was conveyed there was our strong intention to give Ukraine everything it needs to defeat Russia's forces. But again, we don't know. I agree with Wes that we should be having contact with Russians, but that's contact that only makes sense as long as the message that we deliver is the appropriate one. Again, that Russia will lose in Ukraine, we'll make sure that happens with the weapons we supply, and we will make sure that Moscow's nuclear advantage and WMD advantage over Ukraine meets the appropriate response.
Super, thank you. General Clark, this is a question from Maria. She says, the more the West arms Ukraine, the closer to victory and peace we will be. However, is there any possibility for China to turn its back against Russia and push Putin more in the near future?
Well, I think China doesn't want to be associated with the loser. China doesn't also want to see Russia exactly fall apart and be defeated by the West. So China would like to sort of have it exactly like it is right now. China would like to say it's giving support to Russia, would like to not give too much support. China doesn't want a triumphant Putin on its border. China wants Russian technology, Russian energy, and Russia's Siberia in the midterm. It does not want a strong, powerful Russia, no matter what it says. So it's in an odd position right now. It's what it would like to do is weaken the European Union, pull the European Union away from the United States if possible, through investments and through offering its markets, taking European technology, especially German and French technology. And so that's, Xi Jinping has an economic challenge. He has a health crisis still ricocheting around China. And he has built his power on Chinese nationalism. So he's going to have to, at some point, show some progress on Taiwan. And this is the problem that we've had at the G20 and the Xi-Biden summit is, yes, we can talk. Yes, we should find ways to work together. But this Taiwan issue is going to grow and grow and grow as a point of contention between the two of us and between the two powers. It's going to, at some point, have to be dealt with in a really constructive way. We don't see that yet. We don't see the way through that yet. But the important thing is don't let the shooting get started there.
Thank you, General Clark. Zag, question for you. How realistic is that Ukrainian forces reach and hold Crimea, and when?
Well, we obviously, we cannot say when, and we obviously understand that when we reach Crimea, the Russian army is going to be so exhausted that basically they will be asking for some sort of negotiations, deal, ceasefire, whatever else. And for obvious reasons, we will address the other regions first. I have a strong suspicion that by that time, Putin is not going to be running the country. And there will be some other people running the country. I mean, at least that there is like a high probability of that, much higher than many people think. And in this case, the new government may be much more agreeable to that. But we do believe that the Russian army is weak as it can be. I mean, as it has been ever in the history, let's put it this way. And certainly we're going to push forward. And by the time we will be in a capacity to enter Crimea.
Gotcha. Thank you, Jennifer. This is a great question from Viola Ginger. She says, there has been some reporting that Western military contributing partners are concerned about their equipment supplies being drained if they send too much more to Ukraine. I've definitely heard this from the Germans. Is there anything to that? And if the West doesn't have enough material to support this war, how could they fight a larger war anywhere should it ever be necessary?
Look, from what I understand, this is indeed a real issue, and it's an issue here at home. The United States does not have the industrial base that we need. And I think in some respects, the Ukrainians have done us a favor by not only fighting this conflict on behalf of the entire West and democracy, but also highlighting the realities that we face in this dangerous current world. The United States needs to be more prepared. Now, we cannot afford to allow the Ukrainian war to protract further. I think that's been well covered here, but I do think we need to continue to accept some risk in order to get Ukraine the supplies that they need, because the cost of inaction in Ukraine remains higher than whatever cost we face dealing with these difficulties of our supplies at home and our industrial base at home. The cost of inaction, or the cost of insufficient action here, means giving Putin enough time to try to drag this war out to sap Western will, or God forbid, giving Putin enough time to build back up a capable armed forces.
Yep.
We know what he will do if he builds back up a capable armed forces. He will reinitiate an invasion of Ukraine, and he has made clear his intent to actually threaten NATO countries next. We know what happens if we do not win this fight, if we do not support the Ukrainians in winning this fight now. That has to happen. So too must America prepare, because this is not going to be, unfortunately, the last threat to the current world order that we're going to face in coming decades. And we are not as prepared as we need to be.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah,
Just
please, John,
on
go
this?
ahead.
This refers to the fact that our defense industry is not prepared for the era of great power competition.
Yep.
So Jennifer's right that in a sense, Ukraine has given us a warning of what we need. So the administration has been in talks with the defense industry basically since the spring, and they haven't yet figured out how to ensure the ramp up of production that we need, not just to help Ukraine defeat Putin, but to prepare ourselves for any nastiness in the South and East China Seas. So we've got to solve this problem, and I suspect we will. But right now, we have not seen sufficient leadership from the White House to attack this as an essential matter, to attack it the way we attacked COVID a couple of years ago. If we do that, we will certainly fix it, but we haven't gotten there yet.
John, keep your mute unmic, or keep it unmuted. Here we go. This is the question you've been waiting for. There are loud, uninformed voices among Republican members of Congress calling for the end of aid to Ukraine. There's a new letter out today. What kinds of efforts are being made to educate these politicians who have the ear of so many Americans?
I think that we need a concerted bipartisan effort to lay out in very clear terms the message that Jennifer just gave, which is that we have a vital stake in helping Ukraine defeat Putin because Putin's objectives go beyond Ukraine. And $40 billion in the abstract seems like a great deal of money. But if you understand that a Putin victorious in Ukraine is going to move on our Baltic NATO allies, you realize that $40 billion is a trifle compared to the cost to the United States Treasury, and for that matter, to American soldiers who'd be fighting in the Baltic states. If we had a clear message like that stated every 3 days from the White House, amplified by people in Congress like Mitch McConnell, who understand this very well, I suspect that the voices of quasi-isolationism would begin to understand that their position is, in fact, a direct contradiction of their stated interest in making America a great power again.
Thank you so much. General Clark, how will the world hold Russia accountable for all the war crimes that we've seen in Ukraine?
I think the process is already underway. It's first to get the evidence. So you have a judicial standard of evidence, not an intelligence standard, but a judicial standard. You have eyewitnesses, you have testimony, you have time, place, specifics, and then you build the mechanism around that through the United Nations, either through the International Criminal Court or a special tribunal established by the United Nations. This is going to have to be a major element in whatever peace agreement emerges at the end. It cannot be simply Russia says, okay, let's just stop the fighting. We'll pull back and then you can buy our fuel again. No, it's not going to happen. As President Zelensky said, there have to be reparations and there has to be accountability. And ultimately, this accountability falls on Mr. Putin. He's the one that started the war and the people around him, including men like Patrushev. And so this is why I think the United States really has to think through this. You cannot simply, I know this is the way democracies like to do it, is simply push the problem back, get through the next election cycle, let the next administration work it. There's been 100 years of this, from Vladimir Lenin on, of the exploitation of the Russian people and destruction in the West. It's time, it's over. Putin's overplayed his hand. The regime needs to go away. And I think that the pressure from Ukraine, the concerted resolution of the United States, whether or not we say we want regime change, I think Putin's going to be finished as a result of this. And so I think we will see the mechanisms of international justice unfold in the aftermath of this. I certainly hope so. I certainly hope we don't turn our backs on it. You know, it's taken years after the conflict in Yugoslavia. Yep. And we still don't have the real records. We don't know all the people, but General Mladic is in jail. And he was one of the perpetrators of the war crime. We got a lot of the top people. We didn't get all the others who participated, but we got some of the top people. Milosevic, of course, killed himself in there. And so the wheels of justice move slowly, yep, but they do move.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And in particular, it's going to be very difficult in a place like Mariupol, where investigators still can't get in and document a lot of these war crimes. So it's a long road ahead. I'm going to give the last question to Ambassador Herbst. Ambassador Herbst, this is a question from Joe Morley Davies. He says, Putin has a habit of turning disasters to his domestic advantage. And here he cites the 1999 apartment bombings, Beslan, and then the Dubrovka Theater. Is there any way for him to salvage the situation domestically at this point?
Oh, the bombings in the first one you mentioned may well have been a Russian operation, an intelligence operation. I think that Putin is in a very difficult spot. Everything that has happened since the big invasion and his reactions to it, the ridiculous annexations, quote unquote, the partial mobilization, quote unquote, have all led to further unhappiness within Russia. If those experts who say that Putin has full control of the information and the police function in Russia are correct, Putin can announce tomorrow his withdrawal, saying he's chastised those Nazis in Ukraine. They've learned their lesson. But it seems that he is obsessed with Ukraine and is psychologically unable to do that. Were he to do that, he might salvage his own rule. If he continues to try to find a way to impose his will on Ukraine and the West, and again, if American and Western support for Ukraine continues at least its current level, I think Putin is sealing the doom of his own regime. But when that happens, hard to say.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Herbst. No one here wants to take the bait and play Old Testament prophet. I'm kind of disappointed in you guys and gals. Thank you so much for spending an hour of your day with us. It was a real pleasure. Please keep your eye on the Atlantic Council website for more events on Ukraine. We will be following it. Thank you. Have a nice day, and God bless Ukraine.
Thank you.